Cross question on the panel tonight. To my left, Caroline Lucas, Green Party MP for Brighton Pavilion and, of course, former leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Alexander Stafford is next to her, Conservative MP for Rother Valley. Julia Langdon is beside me on my right, political journalist and broadcaster. And Mo Hussein is a political commentator and former communications advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister all those years ago. It seems like decades, doesn't it? But it isn't. The number to call if you'd like to ask a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. We're going to be talking about Liz Truss and her return to politics in the next hour, but I'd kind of like a question on that because I feel our panel might have something to say on what she's been saying over the last 24 hours. She's given a broadcast interview tonight, so we might talk about that a little bit as well. And if you'd like to watch us as well as listen to us, you can on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
And let's go to our first caller. It's our old friend, Pauline in Watford. Hello, Pauline.
Hello,
I didn't mean to call
Iain.
you old, by the way.
That's all right. Listen, I prefer to be old rather than dead. You do know that is a choice we have.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, so is Sunak and Co.'s refusal to negotiate on pay for the NHS and others very likely to also crash the UK's economy?
Caroline Lucas.
Is it likely to crash the UK economy? I mean, it's going to absolutely destroy the NHS, which is a starting point. I mean, the idea that he won't even get around a table to talk with the nurses, I think, is just unforgivable. And this mantra that we keep hearing that nothing can be afforded. Actually, the issue of whether to pay public sector workers properly and how much to pay them is a question of political choice. There are things they could do, the government could do, to raise money. They could, for example, stop subsidising fossil fuels to the tune of £11 billion every year, or they could levy a wealth tax, or they could close the loophole in the windfall tax, which currently means that fossil fuel companies are getting away pretty much scot-free without having to pay very much of that so-called windfall tax. So I think the issue is that this is a matter of political choice, and I think the government should be making different choices. They should be paying nurses enough to make a decent living. They should be attracting more people into the NHS because we've got a massive problem when it comes to retention. I was on the picket line and speaking to my local nurses in Brighton this morning, and they are really struggling to make ends meet. They are really struggling to give the kind of care that they went into the NHS to give because they are so short-staffed. They are totally demoralised. And to have a Prime Minister that won't even get round the table with them, I think is just an absolute slap in the face.
You're absolutely right that I think nurses are generally overworked and probably are underpaid, but the average wage for a nurse, I think, is $34,000 a year, which is about $5,000 above the national average. So one could say that there are maybe other people who are finding it even more difficult to earn a living than nurses. I mean, I'm not trying to pitch worker against worker, but I mean, you have to sort of look at the actual statistics rather than sometimes listen to the anecdotal evidence.
I think what you could be looking at is the pay that public sector workers are getting and look at how that compares to private sector workers. And we know that the pay of public sector workers is nowhere near keeping up with inflation. And so, for example, an experienced nurse is now 20% worse off than she was if she started in 2010, for example. So people are seeing their salaries go down, their incomes go down at the same time that they have a whole load of fixed commitments, whether that's rent or mortgages or anything else. And it's just unsustainable. So I think we need to look much more in the round about public sector pay and actually step up and make sure that it does keep pace with inflation. If we want decent public services, we have to pay for it. And I wish we'd have that conversation instead of pretending that there's some kind of, rule from God that says that you can't pay people more and that you can't make different political choices. I think we should.
Alexander Stafford, Caroline is right, isn't she, that this is a political choice, that the government have decided that they're not going to open the coffers for not just nurses but other public sector groups as well. And they could get round the table and negotiate a compromise, but they seem not to want to do that.
Well, I think the important thing to understand is when you're asking for 19% pay rise as a starting point, that is completely unsustainable. If you apply that across the whole public sector, that's going to cost £28 billion. What we need to do is get people around the table, but with realistic targets. We want people to earn more money, of course we do, but we are dealing with huge rampant inflation, as we know, up to 10%. So we need to make sure that pay rises are given do not exacerbate inflation any further. And as you said, Iain, you said that the starting salary was like £34,000 plus.
No. The starting salary at the moment is 28, but moving up to 30 in September.
Yes, but the average on 34,000. But they also get a 20% pension on top as well. So you've got to look at the whole pay package as well. But what we want is to reward our hard-working nurses, and not just reward them, make sure our hard-working nurses feel their reward as well. But we need to get.
So you accept that they don't at the moment. You accept that they don't feel that they're being amply rewarded for the work that they do?
Well, clearly, as they're on strike, they want to be more rewarded, and we need to have a proper conversation. But I don't think we have a starting point of 19% increase. We have to be realistic.
Have a conversation, though, if the government won't get round the table. The conversation isn't even happening. And we've seen what's happened in Wales, for example, where they haven't pushed for that 19% when they actually got round the table, that they actually were able to come to a compromise. But you can't have a dialogue with one person. The government needs to get round that table.
And we need to have that conversation, but we can't have a 19% rise. You need to have a realistic target.
I've just said in Wales they ended up with something that was lower. The Nurses' Union have said that they would accept something lower.
And why didn't they have something lower now?
Well, because if they got the government in the room, I'm sure they would, but you can't negotiate with an empty chair.
Julia Langdon.
Well, Alexander said just now, get people round the table. Why are they not round the table? I suspect that the government have been caught out because they thought they were going to win public sympathy on this because people could see what was going wrong in the National Health Service. And they haven't. They've also been caught out by what has happened in the economy and the fact that they are negotiating on. They're talking about the difference between this year and last year, and the nurses are talking. Their figures are based on what they are not what they're faced with now, with inflation at double what it was when they were negotiating this year's round. It's palpably unfair, and I just don't understand why the government which is in so much trouble in so many different areas, is running the gauntlet of public opinion in such a way over such an emotive subject. There are huge structural problems with the National Health Service which have to be addressed. They should look at those. They could easily find a form of words in order to negotiate the structural problems and the staffing problems and the drain of staff that are leaving all the time. That could easily be done, and I don't understand why they're not doing it.
Mo, you were advising the government when Jeremy Hunt was Health Secretary, I think, when there was the junior doctors dispute. Yeah. And I imagine there will have been people around those tables saying, you're never going to win a battle with the junior doctors, or you're never going to win a battle with the nurses. And I mean, it's just a fact of life, isn't it? Public sympathy will always be with the nurses.
Yeah, those conversations certainly were happening at that point, and I'm pretty sure they are happening now. That you're not going to win in the court of public opinion on this, but the government does need to think more in the round rather than pitting worker against worker. If you choose one kind of worker, are you then setting a precedent for others? Are you saying their work is much more important than other public sector workers? You have a responsibility for taxpayers' money as well. But I do think we all want to avoid seeing more days of tens of thousands of appointments being missed, operations being cancelled. So there is a responsibility for engagement, which does involve getting around the table and having a realistic approach. We've seen it happen in other parts of the UK. I'm pretty sure it can happen here, but it takes willing on both sides.
Exactly. But what is preventing this from happening? Because, I mean, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, has held talks with the unions, but apparently he won't talk about this year's pay round. He wants to talk about next year's, which you think, well, you've got to fix this year's first.
Yeah, that seems to be the key issue. And I think the calculation from the government is next year the economy might be in a better position, so you can probably have a bit more money to play around with, but you need to deal with the issues here and now.
But why not then do a long-term deal and say, OK, well, look, we do want to talk about next year as well, and we understand your point about you've lost 20% over the last 12 years. Let's look at a 5-year deal, And over the 5 years, you can recover that 20%. Now, at least that would be a starting point, wouldn't it?
It would be, or you could look at one-off payments. You could look at something to address the issue. I'm afraid the government is not looking long-term at anything right now with 2 years or so towards an election. And even if you say you're going to have a 5-year deal, what's the guarantee that will actually happen? That could get changed again. So I'm not sure that is the answer, but addressing the issues people are facing now rather than kicking everything down the road to next year, I think would be certainly wise.
Any further comments on this, or we can move on? No?
I think we're all agreed, really.
Well, you've all sort of said there should be talks, so I think we can probably unite on that. But Rory isn't very happy. Somebody, I don't know whether it was me, I think it was either Caroline or Alexander, said she, referring to nurses. You did. Well, Rory wishes to admonish you because he says that gay men are nurses too.
You're right.
I know that because I was one once. But straight men are nurses too. We should point out just for digging a hole for ourselves here, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, I stand rightly corrected, Rory. Thank you.
Right. Paul in Paisley says, as everybody is to blame for its failure, apart from, of course, its architects, are you all still showing recalcitrance towards Liz Truss and her bold fiscal agenda? Julia Langdon.
Is that what it was?
What's she on is what I want to know. I haven't heard today's Spectator interview, but I did look at it before coming here, and it was 51 minutes and 9 seconds. And I thought, is life long enough to listen to 51 minutes of Liz Truss? No. I cannot think what her game is if she remains a Conservative who believes that the Conservatives might have any palpable chance of winning the next general election, because all she's done is pitch in and give the Prime Minister yet another headache. He's got a series of them. I find it endlessly diverting and extremely amusing, and thanks very much, Liz.
Alexander Stafford, I don't know who you voted for in the
members round, not members, the Conservative Party members. I did vote for Liz. Yeah.
Okay. So, what do you make of her re-emergence? Do you welcome it?
Has she been in touch?
I have not spoken to her recently, and I think sometimes you need to take a bit longer to work out what went wrong and what went right, and maybe only 100 and something days after leaving office probably isn't the right time for her to have a public intervention.
Very diplomatically put. In other words, shut up.
I guess the question is, what are you trying to achieve from all of this? We've got to all unite behind the Prime Minister, the Conservatives. We want to make sure that we achieve his agenda, which is, controlling inflation, getting the economy back on track. And does that intervention really help that? I'm not so sure.
But you supported her growth agenda, presumably.
I think it's important that the country grows and the grows economy. That's as all Conservatives. We should support, frankly, all citizens want to grow the economy. So increased economy means better lifestyles for all of us. So we can fund the NHS to have the pay rises we talked about. So then itself is not a bad thing. It's how you achieve that growth and how to make sure you have all the balances look in the right is important.
For the second question in a row, we come to our communications expert. If you were advising Liz Truss, would you have advised her to make this intervention now?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's still so fresh in people's minds, and even with this intervention, there is no mea culpa. There's no real self-awareness as to what went wrong.
There's a bit of explanation.
There's a bit more explanation, but this explanation it's almost after the fact. It wasn't there when she was doing all these things and putting forward her plans for the economy. And now it feels a bit too late. And I think it's not designed to be helpful at all. Let's be clear about that. This is designed to speak to a section of the Conservative Party members and MPs to remind them that there is an alternative. And, there is a view among some people on the Conservative benches that this government is not Conservative anymore. It's doing things that are too mainstream, too Labour-light. And how do we get back to the Conservative agenda, however you want to define it? And it's clear how Liz Truss defines it in terms of high growth, low tax. I don't think anybody is going to argue for low growth. People want high growth, but her execution and the way she did it is what is in question here and what is wrong. And it feels to me, if you look at the polling and you look at what could potentially happen next election, this is a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party going forward. What kind of party is it going to be, and what is it going to call for, perhaps from the opposition benches? And this is what I think is going on.
I read this article yesterday, Caroline Lucas, and stupidly tweeted about it. And I said it was worth a read, which obviously meant that I was a Liz Truss shill, even though ever since she first stood for the leadership of the Tory party, I think I've only ever said critical things about her. But given that she is an ex-Prime Minister, OK, she was only there for 49 days, should we not listen to what ex-Prime Ministers say?
I think when you're an ex-Prime Minister who crashed the economy quite so dramatically, who, Julia said it's amusing, and on one level it is, but actually people whose mortgages have spiralled, who haven't been able to get mortgages, who are on the brink of getting them, whose pension funds have tumbled, I don't think those people are seeing the funny side of this at all. And it really does feel as if sorry is the hardest word, doesn't it? That's the word that seems to be missing in everything that I've read. She's blaming everybody except herself. I liked the bit where she railed against the left-wing economic establishment, including people like the Office. Well, yeah, absolutely. But so perhaps more unpredictably was the Office for Budget Responsibility set up by the Conservatives, whose independent forecast she decided not to have. I thought the Tory peer Lord Barwell put it really nicely. He said, "You were brought down because in a matter of weeks you lost the confidence of the financial markets, the electorate and your own MPs." That was one of Gavin Barwell's tweets earlier today, and I think he's spot on that.
Well, that is factual, at least, I suppose. Alexander, you wanted to quickly comment?
Just some of the economic stuff which Caroline mentioned. If you look at the FTSE is booming at the moment, the pensions are recovering or have recovered as we've seen. And if you look at inflation, mortgage rates across Europe, they've all been hit. We're having inflation across. In fact, Britain is actually reducing its inflation, while other countries increasing their inflation. So I think I challenge some of Caroline's notions about what happened there.
Well, it's reducing its inflation, I think, by 0.4% over the last 2 months, so it's not exactly a massive achievement.
But lower than 17 other EU countries.
OK. Right, we're going to move on in a moment. Some really good questions coming in. 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
21 minutes past 8. Caroline Lucas, Alexander Stafford, Julia Langdon and Mo Hussein answering your questions. Let's go to David in Preston. Hello. Or is it Davida in Preston? Hello.
It is. Hello.
Hello,
everybody.
what would you like to say?
Yeah, what should we do about China's economic and military expansionism?
I guess you're asking this. I'm surmising it's to do with the balloon that was shot down. Was it shot down over America? I think it was. And there's apparently another one from China, a second balloon that's been spotted over Latin America. But of course, the Chinese insists that they're weather balloons. Who knew that they were so interested in the weather in South America? Mo, let's start with you.
This is something that I think has plagued many governments and decision makers. And when I was in number 10, there was a lot of getting quite close to China and talk about golden decade and expanded trade. And I think where you have to come up to is you do have to be quite tough on things like human rights abuses that we are seeing, on issues where, as we saw last week, if they are invading someone's sovereign airspace, and if you are trying to control or manipulate global trade by offering incentives to developing countries that may not be fair or moral, but equally we also need to speak to China on issues that affect all of us, whether that is climate change, whether that is supply chains and the impact we've seen of the pandemic on them over the last few years. So I'm afraid it is having a balance and getting that balance right. It doesn't mean you kowtow. It doesn't mean you hold your tongue. But we can't just isolate, I don't think, given the economic might that they have. And by that, I mean the impact that has on us and the people across the UK.
Do you think in the government which you were an advisor to, do you think that Cameron and Osborne cozied up a little bit too much to China in retrospect?
Yes, in retrospect. I think there were things that probably not turning a blind eye to, but they just weren't as apparent as they are now. And given that geopolitics, particularly with Russia and Ukraine, which is polarizing countries in the world, you do need to think about, if something like that were to happen again, whose side would a certain country be on? So in retrospect, yes, I think there was probably too close a relationship.
Julia?
Well, there's some completely terrifying stuff around about secrecy, and there was a warning from one of our spy chiefs a few weeks ago saying that we all, and the government in particular, and public services and industry should be much, much, much more cautious about protection of data, because we are being looked at. I don't have anything much to hide, but the government does, and I think it's quite terrifying. And it's the balloon incident is bizarre. I mean, that is really strange, but seems a two off, because there's one floating across South America, I believe, as well. And I imagine they don't have as much of interest for the Chinese, or maybe they're interested in drug what's going on in the drug wars. But that was really odd, and it was also provided a very interesting trial for Biden, because the right, of course, were very anxious that it be shot down immediately, and he apparently gave the agreement to shoot the balloon down last Wednesday, but had to wait until it floated across. It was no longer over his citizenry.
And it did, of course, mean that the Secretary of State, Blinken, cancelled his trip to Beijing, which the Chinese were apparently very keen that happened. So there's obviously something going on here that we don't know the full details of, but it is, as Julia says, a bit weird, isn't it, Caroline?
I think it is a bit weird. I think in terms of response, I pretty much agree with what Mo said, in the sense that I do think we need a more consistent attitude towards China. I'm deeply concerned about what's happening in Xinjiang with the human rights abuses of the Uyghur people there, and I think, our government hasn't been prepared to say that's genocide, hasn't been prepared to call it out as much as it should. It has called it out, but not as much as I think it should. So on the one hand, I would like us to be much firmer when it comes to human rights, but at the same time, you don't want to isolate countries, because then you have absolutely no influence with them at all. So it is a really difficult one, for sure.
Alexander?
Well, without a doubt, China is the greatest threat to the world. It's the most dangerous country, it's one of the most powerful countries. We know clearly the human rights abuses from the Uyghurs, but also what's going on in Hong Kong, what's going on in Tibet. These are, frankly, nasty, as a nasty country, doing nasty things to its own people. They are a threat to our national security. We know they are constantly spying on us. I think it's an interesting point about the weather balloon, the so-called weather balloon. I think when the U-2 was shot down, that was claimed to be a weather plane as well, initially, in the reports. Clearly, this is what's going on. I think Biden should have shot it down earlier on. It says a lot about America's power, or almost reticent to take out this balloon, which could have been spying and all knows what. But fundamentally, the China policy across the West has been a complete failure for the last decade. We very much believe clearly that capitalism and democracy went hand in hand, and as we always believe that China's trying to get richer, they become more and more democratic. We've seen in the last decade quite the opposite. The Chinese standard of living has massively increased, got massively richer, but there's no sign of democracy, quite the opposite. And we need to have a far tougher line against China. We need to stand with our allies, especially like in Taiwan, to protect them, because China will keep going. And one point that's very important is we are going to a net zero future, which is incredibly important, and we need that for our energy and our power and all that. But China controls that. It controls the critical mineral, controls the heavy metals, it controls things that make our net zero future possible. And there is that concern with their investment and their control over parts of Africa and other countries and Latin America. They'll control those minerals, and they could literally switch the lights off in a few years if we don't take control of that ourselves.
Does that concern you? Because, I mean, that is true. They do have control over a lot of these things that are absolutely vital to the green agenda.
They do, and I think that's probably another reason not to go down a road of total isolation. I think we do need to be talking with them at the same time as
but does that not make you think that the government is right, therefore, not to alienate them by describing what's happening in Xinjiang as genocide? Which, I mean, I agree with you, it is, but this is realpolitik at work here, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I think if you're talking about the genocide, there have to be some red lines, irrespective of realpolitik, and to me, that's a pretty big red line.
Other view?
Well, there's also the Hong Kong issue. I mean, the government haven't been fierce enough with the Chinese about.
But what could they do? There's no point in being fierce if there's not going to be any end result, is there?
No. Diplomacy. Lynn Truss, I believe, is going to weigh in on this subject shortly in the course
Lynn
of the
Truss?
week. Lynn Truss. No, not Lynn Truss. Liz Truss.
Well,
the great grammarian.
You never know. Right, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. Don't forget, if you miss an episode of Cross Question, you can always catch up on the Cross Question podcast. It's released about between 10 and 11 p.m. Mondays, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. 0345 6060 973. That's the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel on LBC. That's the first time I think we've done 4 questions in the first half an hour, so well done to our panel. It's 8:30 on LBC News Headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
Search and rescue teams from across the world are frantically looking for survivors in Turkey and Syria after a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. Around 3,000 people are thought to have died, with many more injured after it hit in the early hours of this morning. A man who murdered a woman and her 2-year-old daughter before burying them under his kitchen floor has been jailed for at least 36 years. Andrew Innes killed Benelin and Jellica Burke in Dundee in 2021. The Royal College of Nursing says strikes over pay will continue for as long as it takes. Thousands of NHS staff have been staging the biggest walkout in the history of the health service. LBC weather, plenty of winter sunshine in the south tomorrow, some light rain for Scotland and a high of 9 Celsius.
This is LBC.
It's 8:32 on LBC. Caroline Lucas is here, Green Party MP for Brighton Pavilion, former party leader. Alexander Stafford is Conservative MP for Rother Valley, yet to be party leader, but, I mean, who knows?
One day.
Julia Langdon, political journalist and broadcaster, and Mo Hussein, political commentator, former communications advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. Right, let's go to another text question. Rachel Reeves, this is from Sharon in Dagenham. Rachel Reeves seemed a bit flaky in the last hour on whether Sadiq Khan's ULEZ expansion should be scrapped or delayed. Are green policies like this worth it if they push people further into poverty? Now, this is Sadiq Khan is coming under pressure, not least from Martin Lewis, to delay the ULEZ expansion by a year because it obviously will hit a lot of people in the cost of living crisis. Caroline, I've got to come to you first on this.
I think that there needs to be good support for people to enable them to choose less polluting options. But essentially, when we know that air pollution is leading to the premature deaths of thousands of people every year, then it seems to me that we need to act on that. And that includes expanding the ULEZ in the way that he is proposing. But I take the point that some people are dependent on dirty vehicles at the moment. That's the only vehicle they've got. And therefore, I think that the scrappage scheme should be, I don't know what scrappage scheme he's got, but if there is one, let's look at it and see how generous it is. Let's look at ways of having as much public transport as possible. Again, I appreciate for some people who depend on their vehicle for work, then public transport might not be an option. But it seems to me
one of our reporters tested that out last week and tried to, I think he was pretending to be a builder and took his ladder on the tube or something.
Yeah, well, that might not be such a good idea.
It didn't go very well.
No, well, that's why I said that some people clearly will need their vehicles for work, such as people with long ladders. But there is something serious here, and what's serious is that there's a climate emergency, there is an air pollution epidemic, and we need to take action to address those. And if that means, getting some more money to people on lower incomes to enable them to have more choices so that they're not clobbered by a policy, then we should be doing that, not delaying the policy that we know is going to drive the climate emergency and that we know is going to drive air pollution.
You accept that there are a lot of people who run small businesses, maybe they're one-person businesses, who are going to be very adversely affected by this. Would it not be you obviously can't speak for Sadiq Khan, but I would have thought that there ought to be some sort of solution where he could give exemptions for a little bit longer, maybe particularly given the current circumstances.
To be honest, I've not looked in detail at his policy here, but there may be some slightly slower introduction for particular groups that are in the category that you describe. But I think a blanket delay to the whole scheme would just be irresponsible when we know that the damage that air pollution is doing. I'm just introducing a bill into Parliament just now called Ella's Law, and you'll know Rosamond Adu Kissi-Debrah, whose daughter Ella Roberta was the first person to have air pollution written on their death certificate as the cause of death. And she is, a mighty campaigner, as you would expect she would be, her mother. And through working with her, I know that air pollution is a killer. And through all the work that we've done on climate change, we know climate change is a killer too. And so those have to be guiding principles. And then we work out how we support people, how we protect those people who are going to find this most difficult, but don't actually resile from the main principles of this policy, which are absolutely vital.
I'm going to be very careful how I put this. I hope I'm going to be careful anyway, because you're right, her mother is a doughty campaigner, but there will be people who are listening who are saying, well, that is one very tragic case. You can't therefore extrapolate from that there are hundreds or even thousands of other people who could be affected in exactly the same way, and yet our lives are being ruined by this policy.
I'm not making that extrapolation. There is plenty of evidence out there, scientific evidence, that of the impact that air pollution is having on terms of premature deaths of people in London and other places around this country.
Because these are going to be in other places soon, aren't they, these ULEZ zones?
I believe they are, but let's make sure that we do them in the right way and have cheap public transport alternatives. In many towns and cities around the world now, they actually have free public transport. Let's look at ways we can make this easier rather than actually resigning from the policy.
Well, I think I don't know too much about it. So I'm not a London MP, but from what I gather, these ULEZ is an absolute expansion disaster. We've got one coming in my nearest city in Sheffield, a similar scheme. I think they are incredibly damaging for business because they hit people who need to use their vehicles to work, especially when we're having tough economic times. We need people to get to work. We can't add extra money to people's bills. I think they're incredibly discriminatory against parents and people who need to use their cars, who can't practically, I've got 2 small children, you can't just practically get them on the bus and the tube the whole time. There's, for instance, one
some people have to.
Some people have to, yes, but we shouldn't discriminate those people that can't use public transport. In areas like mine, where there isn't any good public transport, that we need to do that. We're hitting people and we're not actually doing solving the problem, because what all the evidence shows is as soon as you move a clean air zone, as they call it, into one area, all that pollution still stays there but goes around the periphery and creates more pollution. It's actually a simple way of just moving the problem. What we should be doing is looking at other schemes, such as trying to get encourage more people into electric vehicles, which is happening. A third of cars will sold now electric vehicles. That should be good. We should keep the subsidies on electric vehicles, but also more basic things. If you go to cities like Singapore, every street corner has trees on every in the middle of all the roads. There's plants. We can use natural solutions to take away air pollution. We should be looking at that rather than clobbering people who need their vehicles to work. And this is a very discriminatory policy. Those who don't have good public transport, who can't afford to upgrade their cars, it penalises. And also, it's far better in some ways having, let's say, an older white van diesel, if you're doing a certain number of miles, than actually scrapping the vehicle and buying a completely new vehicle. You have to drive a new vehicle, even a clean vehicle, significantly for a single length of time before you're actually making air pollution or savings. And one last thing, our area is actually getting cleaner. It's getting dramatically cleaner than it used to be. If you go back to the 50s when the Great Smog that killed loads of people, we don't have that anymore. Our air is so much cleaner than it was 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. We are moving in the right direction already. We don't need these things to hit people during the cost of living crisis.
It's interesting you say about electric vehicles. Having spent 4 days in Berlin, I did not see one single electric vehicle charging point. And we always think of the Germans as being ahead of us on all of these things. I'm not sure. In fact, I can't remember seeing many electric cars at all. Julia?
Well, I agree with everything that Caroline said in principle and in practice, but in my next life I'm going to be a politician. I agree with Martin Lewis. I think it should be delayed for a bit, just while the circumstances are so difficult. It seemed to, as far as I'm aware, it seemed to come from nowhere that it's going to happen in June.
To be fair, it has been shown for quite a long time.
Yes, it has. But I suddenly thought, oh my God, my car was going to be affected, but it isn't. But I do think it is incredibly hard on small businesses in the outer suburbs. I read a story actually about the stationers of the House of Commons apparently are not going to be able to carry on their business. Were you writing about that?
No, I wasn't, but I read that too.
It's really very, very difficult on people with small businesses in the outer suburbs who should be given a bit more time to come to terms with it while the economy is in such while they are suffering from the effects of the economy.
Mo?
I think whenever you do something like this, you really have to take people with you and you have to look at the impacts across the board. So there is a real case for exemptions or for slowing this down a bit. But the wider point, I think, here, and we saw this when we hosted COP as well, where there was a big buzz around it, but I don't think there was ever a real big education piece in terms of what does pursuing net zero actually mean for people, for their incomes, for how this might be invading into their choices, into their lives. And this is a difficult conversation to have, but we have to have an honest conversation about it, because it will have a cost, and it will mean people perhaps coming into your home and doing things without you having much of a say on them. You know, it could mean many different things, but we need to have that very real education and conversation piece. Otherwise, people aren't really going to understand what net zero is, why it matters. Just because it's in a law in 2050, somebody else can deal with it down the line. And to change that approach and to change that mentality, I think honesty and transparency and levelling with people about the choices facing us is going to be quite important.
And I think the finance is really important as well, coming back to that. I think Mo's right in a sense that this particular question is a kind of microcosm of many of the green debates that we will have, and it is vitally important that green policies don't hit the poorest hardest, and we need to design them so they don't. And there's an awful lot of work that's been going on in lots of different organisations around the place who are exactly working out how you would have a just transition. How do you make sure that we're bringing the poorest people with us and supporting them? And of course, the poorest people are not driving cars anyway. They are dependent on a public transport system, which is generally...
Well, in rural areas, actually you're wrong, because in rural areas they will be driving cars, but they'll be driving quite old cars, because there is no public transport, very little public transport.
And everybody in London is going to sell their polluting cars to people who live outside.
And I think there's a big cynicism, but this is the expansion of the ULEZ. The ULEZ was introduced not that long ago and suddenly is expanding already, which clearly is just a cash grab by the mayor who's bankrupted the transport because he can't pay his bills. This is just a clear naked cash grab. I think most people see that.
We should point out that the ULEZ expansion is coming in late August, not in June, so a couple of months respite, I suppose. Right, we'll continue with your calls and questions in just a moment. The number to call 0345 6060 973. It's coming up to 8:44.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
8 out of 10 teachers who took part in a survey said they've had to give pupils toothpaste and toothbrush. Mandy in St Albans.
I don't think any of us anticipated the rising cost. I volunteer for my local food bank and we're seeing people turn up who can't afford food at the moment.
How much is a toothbrush?
About £1.
No, I can get you 2 for 25p. If you can't afford a toothbrush, you really have to ask yourself whether you should be having children.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC.
Caroline Lucas, Alexander Stafford, Julia Langdon and Mo Hussein with me, taking your calls and text questions. Somebody says, what's with the London-centric questions? Well, I think we only had one on ULEZ, but that is not London-centric because it's coming to a city near you very, very soon. Manchester, Bristol, Sheffield, Brighton. Not yet. Yeah. You've got a Green Council in Brighton, haven't you?
Yeah.
Not practicing what you preach.
And
It's not a majority Green Council.
And Esther says, does this law apply to MPs in their chauffeur-driven cars to aid pollution? Well, let me let you into a secret. MPs don't get chauffeur-driven cars unless you want to tell me anything different. It's ministers who have, but even they use them a lot less, I think, than they used to. They don't have specific ministerial cars anymore unless you're right at the top of the tree. Right, let's go to a text question from Andy in Telford. What can Britain reasonably do to help the people in Syria affected by the earthquake, given how dangerous that country is already? Now, this is a 7.8 on the Richter scale earthquake that has killed at least 3,000 people in Turkey and Syria. But I think the Syrian question here is actually really interesting because obviously, given the current circumstances, we can't really send money into Syria. So how do we help a country like that in these dire circumstances? Mo, let's come to you first.
Well, it was such a tragic piece of news that we received today, both across Turkey and Syria, all that loss of human life. And I think with Turkey, it's more straightforward. We have sent, I think, 76 specialists going in and equipment going in Syria. We don't have diplomatic relations with that country. We don't have a presence on the ground. And if you think about the civil war that country's already seen, something like this coming on top of that makes things even more difficult. I do think there are some charities operating in Syria that are UK-based. I think one is called the White Hats, possibly, and they are looking to ramp up their...
White Helmets.
They're looking to ramp up their work there. So if there was a way of perhaps supporting them in what they're doing, that I think, people wanted to help, then that's a way of doing that. But otherwise, there is no other formal, official way, unfortunately, of doing that.
Julia?
Well, we have a huge amount of specialist knowledge and expertise apparently in helping in disasters, and I imagine that the Foreign Office is already on the case because there are contingency funds for helping in international rescue.
It's funny, I was listening to, I think it was Tom Swarbrick, had someone from one of the charities who always talk on these issues, and she was complaining that the response from the West wasn't quick enough. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, it only happened this morning.
Yes.
And I mean, it's presumably in affecting quite remote regions anyway, so it's logistically difficult to get people there within a couple of hours, I would have thought. But anyway, Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, I think working with organisations that are already on the ground is crucial. I think the idea of us, I mean, obviously we may need to take out things that are needed in terms of tents and other kit, but the idea that it's people from the UK sort of dashing out there to help themselves, I think is probably not the best way of doing it. What I would hope is that the government will give some significant resources to organisations on the ground who know what they're doing. I think it's really important that money isn't diverted from existing humanitarian work and overseas development aid and so forth, because that's always the temptation at this point, is to sort of take it out from another allocation where it's also desperately needed. I do think the situation in Syria, though, is, I mean, it's terrible in Turkey and Syria, but I was just thinking about, I think there are around 15 million people in Syria who are already dependent on humanitarian aid because of the conflict there, and so to be hit with this as well is almost unimaginable in terms of the impact that's going to have.
Alexander.
Well, obviously, absolutely devastating what's happening in Syria and Turkey, the earthquake, absolutely awful. I think the big concern, as I've already said, we can get aid and support to Turkey relatively easy. They're our allies, we can do that. But in Syria, it's also mainly the rebel-held areas that have been hit hardest by the earthquake. So I think we'd be very careful about what we do send into there, because some of the rebel-held groups are not very nice, frankly, and we want to make sure any aid or support we do send goes to actually the people affected and isn't diverted or taken off by some of these quite nasty Islamist groups.
And that's a message on the ULEZ issue from Joe, who says, Caroline, I'm a little bit confused because as a Brighton resident, I can tell you that there is in fact a ULEZ zone already. It's on North Street.
Yep, there is, but the thing is you can't drive your own private car. You haven't been able to drive your own private car down North Street I was thinking about this after I said it, for several years. So it's not a new thing that's got lots of controversy. There is, and there are beautiful buses now that go down North Street and up North Street that are properly very, very low emission, and that's great. But what I mean is, what we're not seeing is some of the controversy that you're seeing in London, where suddenly cars are going to be faced with new rules. That's not happening.
We're
at this
so
point.
Brighton-centric on this
Well,
programme.
that's as it should be.
Ulf is in Hamburg. Hello, Ulf.
Good evening, panel. My question. If the EU returned law bill goes through and about 4,000 laws are annihilated, you will lose a lot of employment law protections, and you will lose free trade with the EU because there will be no more level playing field. If you lose the European Human Rights Convention, you will lose unassailable human rights, and you will lose cooperation with the EU in the field of law enforcement and security. What next do you think you are going to lose?
Alexander Stafford.
Well, I think that's not true in the slightest, I must say. We had a Bill of Rights long before we started the ECHR. Obviously, go back to Magna Carta, we had our rights on this. We don't need to have our rights given to us from Europe, whether it's from the EU or from a different European body. I think, especially when it comes to the European Court of Human Rights and ECHR, we need to make sure that we do everything we can to control some of the big crises we're facing in the country, one of which is small boats. And if this helps us deal with the small boats crisis...
How would it help deal with that?
It'll give us more power and freedom to deport the people who come here illegally and give us those powers and actually get things going. One of the big things that happened with when the Rwanda policy failed last year, and I hope it gets going in the future, is that it was ECHR who stopped it. We need to make sure that we have control of who comes in here. And if people come here illegally, we should be able to support them.
I'm right in saying that it was Britain that actually launched the ECHR and drafted most of it back in the 1950s.
And
I mean, are we not in danger of making ourselves an international pariah by doing this? A lot of your colleagues certainly think so.
No, not in the slightest. I think actually, yes, we drafted something 50 years ago and 70 years later it clearly doesn't work.
Well then argue for its reform rather than its abolition.
Like the EU, like we were in the EU, you tried to reform it for decades. We couldn't reform it, so you have to pull out.
This is very different from the EU, though.
It is very different from the EU, but it still shows we cannot control it. And therefore, we as the sovereign country should have control of our own borders and our own laws. There's nothing wrong with that. And actually, I think we can lead the way and create a better way of doing things.
God.
Caroline?
Well, just what a load of rubbish, really. I mean, first of all, I think the Rwanda policy is a really horrible policy. I think it's cruel. I think it's counterproductive. Because you're not giving people alternatives. There are no safe and legal...
What's wrong with Rwanda?
Because, well, I'll tell you, the issue is that if you want to reunite with a family member in the UK, it doesn't help you to be sent to Rwanda. And if you don't have properly set out...
come here illegally?
If you don't have safe and legal routes to get here...
This is not a question on Rwanda, by the way.
Alex, then the only way you can get here is by arriving illegally. That is the tragedy of it. So on the issue that you're holding up to be some kind of wonderful thing for Britain, I think it's a very shameful thing for Britain. Going back to something that Wolf also said, as well as the issue around...
Ulf, without a double.
Ulf, I'm so sorry. Ulf, sorry, Ulf. Something that I think he also said was about what we're losing in terms of thousands of laws that were made, including by British MEPs, of which I was one, environmental laws, health and safety laws, workers' rights laws. We could be losing literally thousands of those in a bonfire at the end of the year.
This bill does not mean that all of these laws are abolished, does it?
No, but it does mean that if the three people who are coordinating the environmental laws in DEFRA, that's what we've heard, there are just three people coordinating what we thought were 570 laws. It's now been updated overnight. It's as if officials suddenly found another 1,000 laws down the back of the sofa. So we're now talking about 1,700 laws. We've got three people in DEFRA who are coordinating this work, and it has to be done by the end of this year. Otherwise, there's a so-called sunset clause, and then you do lose them all. So it's just a preposterous way of approaching any kind of piece of work. So I'm with Ulf. We're losing two bits of important legislation, and as far as they're concerned, we're probably losing our marbles as well.
Julia.
Speechless. And in order to accommodate our new status as out with the European Union, anybody who wants to do any kind of business with Europe now has to engage in a bureaucracy that massively exceeds that which was there before. That's one point. The second, on the human rights issue, this country has a historic reputation for welcoming people to our shores who are in need of help and succour in difficult circumstances. I think we should try and stop them risking their lives by coming across the channel. It is absolutely tragic that has been allowed to carry carry on, but we should be welcoming refugees here and helping them.
Even if they come from countries like Albania, where you don't need to seek refuge from.
Well, in fact, the government has had a minor success there on the Albanian issue.
Because 30% of the people coming across the channel are from Albania.
If you look at the latest figures, apparently because they've now reached an agreement with the Albanian government about sending them back to Albania, the Albanian government, which is a fairly difficult bunch of people, I think, but they are trying to join the European Union, of course, are receiving them back.
Okay, Mo, I'm
Figures
obviously out of date.
yesterday. You've been in Berlin.
Well, I thought it was interesting that actually there's a bit of rowing back from this story that the UK will withdraw from the ECHR from number 10 today. And the line, I think, now has been that any new system will be compliant with our international obligations. I think sometimes you do this in government when you are perhaps a bit weaker and you want to dangle a bit of red meat to your base and your members and your supporters. And I think the position the Prime Minister's now in, particularly with the Liz Truss wing attacking him for maybe not being conservative enough, you need to have a few of these things to throw out there. So I will take a bet that we won't actually end up leaving at all.
Right, our final fun question, sighs of relief or round, or possibly trepidation. Ellie in Walthamstow wants to know, Beyoncé is now the artist with the most Grammy Awards in history, a true pioneer. Who in your mind could possibly equate to her brilliance? Who would like to start? Silence from everybody.
Are we just doing favourite bands? Is that what we're doing?
Go on.
Iron Maiden. Love them, great.
West Ham supporters, so I like that one. Caroline?
Regina Spektor.
Who?
Well, next time, Regina Spektor. I'm giving it for a year.
You're not a musical person.
Well, my music is folk and rock and things, but...
Shall we agree on Cliff Richard?
No!
Mo?
Crosby.
Well, I think actually somebody who probably will end up surpassing that is someone like Taylor Swift, who is already doing quite well and is
so down with the
beginning
kids
of her career. So, but I'm quite happy that Beyoncé is in this position.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Caroline, Alexander, Julia, and Mo. I do think we've covered more questions on this edition of Cross Question than any other in living memory, and the show's been going now 6 years. So well done, everybody. Now, coming up in the next hour, I want to talk about Liz Truss, believe it or not. Do you think a period of silence from the former Prime Minister might be in order after her newspaper article yesterday, her TV appearance today? Or do you think, no, she's an ex-Prime Minister, she was Foreign Secretary as well, she's got every right to express her views, even if she was a crashing disaster for the country? 0345... Was that impartial? 6060 973 is the number to call here on LBC.